All right, this is World Solution Writing Process, Episode 2. It's also Part 2 of the Parallel Government section, or sub-season of this. Now, that's because I have 37 pages in Word about parallel government, and I think I only got through about 4 of them in the last episode because I spent a lot of time introducing the concept of the podcast. So, to keep the reintroduction as brief as possible, basically this podcast is about me trying to write a book, the unidentified me, because I'm worried that social collapse may occur because climate change will cause a food supply disruption by the year 2030, most likely. And well, that's only about 6 years away now. So I don't think global capitalism will address greenhouse gases or climate or anything sufficiently in the next 6 years. So I am writing a book to overthrow global capitalism in the short-term future, centering around a strategy of parallel government, which is a really far-out, heady concept, but admittedly was kind of brought into being by Lenin, so not the first one. Anyway, because I don't want to blow too much of the roughly 20 minutes per episode on recap, I'm going to cut it here and just dive right back in to reading my notes. I'm reading scrambled sections. I have a lot of stream of consciousness writing about different topics, which are effectively my chapters. I've sorted them into topics, which are the chapters. But I mean, each section is still deeply scrambled in this nonlinear format, and just reading it out to myself and turning it into a podcast hopefully will help me get through writing this book, which may take years yet. So this may be like a nick of time kind of book. You know, it may take me 3 years to get it done from now, possibly. You know, and then oddly enough, that will be only about 3 years before the climate deadline. So diving right back into it. We've already burned about 2.5 minutes. So my notes on parallel government continued from last episode. After the change of government, the parallel government could either restore the old election cycle, alter the rules of the elections and hold a new form of elections, which is what I advocate, or just hold on to power and refuse to have any elections. Well, maybe that would be an emergency transitional measure, but I get into a different topic here a little bit. Sometimes I get a little off topic. This kind of belongs in a different section. So changing the electoral system could be done to improve representation, or it could be done to deny political representation to the group you just overthrew. For example, a socialist country could have multi-party elections between socialist parties while banning capitalist parties from the ballot, an arrangement I'm calling socialist multipartyism, or multi-party socialism. Okay, there may be some background noise during this episode from my heater. That's just kind of too bad. I can't do anything about it, but hopefully it won't be too bad. So, now you might say that this multi-party socialism is like things that have already existed in various countries. Personally, I don't think so. I think it's kind of new. For example, you could say China has this little advisory legislature of opposition parties. And I think most of them are socialist, if not all. But that's not the same thing as the true multi-party plural system within the spectrum of socialism, because the leading role of the Communist Party is entrenched in the Chinese constitution, creating this political oligarchy. That is not what I'm trying to create here. But again, this is, well, just to continue the concept so you understand what we're doing. So the point is to ban capitalist parties, for example, from office, not necessarily from existing as an organization, though possibly that too in an emergency, if they try to physically overthrow you. So this might sound harsh, but many countries have banned various Confederates, Royalists, Fascists, and Communists from their legislatures repeatedly. If the parties of slavery, monarchy, and dictatorship can be banned, then so can the parties of wage slavery. And in practice, this is the only way we can be sure to get rid of capitalism permanently. It helps to remember the inherent anti-democratic nature of capitalism, so it sits rightfully among other obsolete and archaic reactionary systems, correctly excluded from office. Now, where did I get this idea? I'll quote it at length later, and I might do another episode just on this little list of parallel government and socialist multipartyist resources. I've created a document to sort of summarize this whole thing. But I actually get it from Mike McNair's Revolutionary Strategy, where he explains that many of the great revolutions of history, like the English Revolution, the French Revolution, involved purges of the legislature. Not like physical guillotine purges, though those came along too, but purges of the legislature in terms of removing specific forces and factions and parties from the legislature on the basis that they were corrupting it from the inside to turn things back to the old system. For example, royalists inside the English Parliament during the English Civil War, they were shown the door during Pride's Purge. Or the French Revolution purged the Girondin from, I believe, the National Convention. But that's getting ahead of ourselves. Back to parallel government. Parallel government can come about by theft or from scratch. Those are the two main modes. By theft is when you take a body that was actually part of the old system, and it sort of stages a mutiny and declares itself against the civil order. So in the American Revolution, you had colonial assemblies, which ended up sort of going renegade against the British Empire and contributing to the Continental Congress. In the French Revolution, you had the Third Estate, which was a legislature called into being by the King of France, which then converted itself into the National Assembly, which was just a pro-democracy legislature against the king. In the English Civil War, same thing. The king summoned the parliament to pay for his war taxes or something. And then parliament turned against the king and eventually beheaded the king. So you can form parallel government by theft, where you have a legislature that's part of the old system, and then it goes renegade. Or you can have parallel government from scratch. So the American Revolution was kind of a hybrid. It was by theft and from scratch, where you had, the colonial assemblies going renegade, but you also had things like the Stamp Act Congress. It seemed to be formed out of a protest movement against Britain. And the Continental Congress was also supported by things like the Committees of Correspondence. And it seemed the Committees of Correspondence, it differed from place to place. Some of them seemed to be sort of revolutionary committees of the colonial assemblies. I think some of the Committees of Correspondence were just dissidents also. And definitely the Continental Congress was supported by the Sons of Liberty, which were simply anti-empire militants. And they were formed, obviously, independently of, they didn't descend from any colonial authority structure. So other examples of people forming parallel government from scratch, you have, in Palestine, you have the Palestinian National Council. And I can't remember the exact formation of how that all worked, but you have the Palestine Liberation Organization, which has its own sort of little parallel government attached to it. I'm looking it up now as I talk. So you have the Palestinian National Council, Palestinian Legislative Council. These are two different things. It's important to keep them separate in our minds, which is why I'm looking them up as we go. Okay, so the Palestinian Authority is ruled by the legislature known as the Palestinian Legislative Council. But the Palestinian National Council is the legislative body of the Palestine Liberation Organization. I'm not sure exactly how that all ties into parallel government. Like I said, my notes are kind of not 100% linear. So these are just things to look up, and maybe I'll sort out what's what later after that. Okay, so parallel government from scratch. Some of the parties of anti-colonialism, like in South Africa, the African National Congress and the Congress of the People. These could be considered parallel government. There was the sort of hybrid model of the Irish Republican Army with the First Dale, which I think was sort of called into being by the British but went renegade. And the IRA was completely from scratch or independent. You have the Outer Planets Alliance, which is a fictional example from the sci-fi show The Expanse. In Fallout New Vegas, you have the concept of an independent Vegas, but in Fallout 4, this is a video game, you have the Commonwealth Provisional Government. Don't worry, I have a lot more real-life examples. Parallel government in history. Well, you have, governments in exile like France during World War II. So you also have bad and weird examples of parallel government. For example, ISIS in Syria is you could say it was a parallel state or parallel government, and it was not a good one. Same with the Confederate States of America. And then at some point in American history, there was this guy, Emperor Norton, who was like just this like total freak who actually like had his own currency minted. And I think he was just this kind of, I don't know much about his biography. My impression is that he was a wanderer. He may have been homeless. And he just declared himself, I think, Emperor of the United States. And only some people in like this sort of unsettled Wild West actually like recognized him. I imagine to many people it was a joke, but looking him up now. Yeah. Okay, Emperor Norton, self-proclaimed Emperor of the United States. I'm not going to go into Emperor Norton's whole biography right now. I was just looking that up. So parallel government strategy involves things like you practice formal democracy, you meet as a legislature, whether in person or digitally, and you pass legislation that will become real when the parallel government replaces the current ruling government. And so in some ways, it's like a party program. It's your list of promises to the people. It's, the things that motivate the public to join the protests or rallies or any action that will bring your government into being as the new government. You can run by self-appointment. You can expand and add new people by a majority vote of the current body or just appointment by the administration. A parallel government should be understood in the end as provisional, where there should be new elections after the revolution. But you need state power to have election logistics. Like, you need the board of elections, or to form your own board of elections in every locality in order to actually hold an election under the rules that you want to hold it according to, which might be excluding entire parties that were, the basis of the old governing coalition. Self-appointment is weird. People have a psychological inhibition against it, but like, if we don't handle this crisis, no one will. So self-appointment is an ethical duty during crisis, and the planet to me seems like it's in deep crisis. It can be provisional. You can have new elections after 6 months or a few years if you need emergency interim period of governing. To actually bring a parallel government into power, you're going to build some kind of movement organization which holds street actions, denounces the ruling government, proclaims and rallies for a new government. Supporters of this, to what extent do you need two separate organizations? Maybe you do, maybe you don't. It's kind of up to you. So there should be, one group of people who are constituting themselves as the legislature, the parallel legislature, and there should be another group of people engaging in street actions in support of this legislature and against the old ruling legislature. And this, could it be the same people doing both? Possibly. If they have time. You may need division of labor if people don't have time to do both. You can escalate street actions to issue campaigns, where you bundle multiple actions together to sort of conceptually group them in people's minds. You can do civil disobedience, which is an escalation. You might want to also avoid that just to keep things low impact, though. I suspect that the concept of parallel government is so powerful intrinsically. It's so intrinsically radical that you may actually have a big impact forming a parallel government while engaging in low impact tactics. Like, civil disobedience is heavy impact. You get arrested, you can get your butt kicked by the police. It's traumatic, we could actually just keep things light, maybe, depending. But, at least in the beginning, you might have to escalate. So Mike McNair in Revolutionary Strategy advocated this form of socialist government that basically excluded capitalist parties but could have multiple factions or parties within itself. Also pointed out it kind of functions as a one-party state in the sense that it implements a certain spectrum of politics but can allow differentiation within that. So it's like, is it a one-party state or is it a multi-party state with like one sort of overarching principle? I prefer to articulate it that way, that it's a multi-faction or pluralistic state with an overarching principle, a managed democracy, you might say, as all bourgeois or Western democracies are managed for capitalism. this will be, under new management. However, I don't really agree with Revolutionary Strategy by Mike McNair's gradualist strategy of opposition. Like, he seems to sort of embrace the social democratic idea of building up slowly by like working through elections and reform struggles, and kind of more on the Bordiga page at this point. So personally, you might be an activist, you might be doing things. As for me, my orientation is not to participate in reform struggles at this point, and to place my energy entirely into the theory of this sort of short-term global transition against capitalism, creating the theory and strategy of it. Most governments really consist of ceremonies. Politics involves theater. Yeah, there are offices and bureaucracies, but it's a lot of ceremony. You may have to create titles for members of your parallel legislature. You may have to, are you a minister of parliament? Are you a representative? Are you a member of the legislative assembly? So while a parallel government should do things like hold legislative sessions and participate in protests, mainly protest for itself, I get into this whole Bordigist orientation that, like, at this point, we shouldn't just be participating in protests. We should be intervening in protests for the purpose of pulling them toward supporting a parallel government. And that's a different thing. It also makes sense for parallel governments to engage in various theatrical performances and surrealist happenings, since most of government is ceremonial anyway. And to be honest, a parallel government is like the ultimate surrealist happening. There's no reason for a parallel government not to hold boring award ceremonies just like the ruling government, except these could be a parody or serious or both. I coin a word I call multiparallelism. So it's this concept of there can be multiple parallel governments. They can critically support each other, or they can just ignore each other, or they can oppose each other. In Syria, there was like a bunch of parallel governments during the Syrian civil war. So multiparallelism, if you embrace the concept, it can soften the competition between parallel governments. At some point, a unitary formation has to emerge as the clear alternative to the ruling government, but there may still be just, straggler little opposition parallel governments, multiple of them, while that situation is playing out. You have a situation with parallel governments which could be reminiscent of the many small third parties which are tiny, or small guerrilla groups that can't unite. So there's a partial pressure towards unification of parallel governments, but not an absolute pressure. Division may also be necessary depending on the situation. So there's pressure toward unity, there's pressure toward division. For pluralism's sake, if you're running like a role-play parallel government to get things started, which I recommend people do, just like as a simulation, just get it started, and it can start as practice and maybe evolve into serious over time. Whatever. You could divide your legislature into a serious party and a silly party, then make everyone switch parties each legislative session. I recommend people use a massively reduced version of Robert's Rules. Basically, motions should be debated, voted on, and you can have secondary motions, which is a motion that you don't debate, a motion for managing other motions. So things don't infinitely scope creep when things infinitely telescope and you just keep growing. Yeah. So, you could declare the city where you organize the parallel government as the nation's new revolutionary capital city, at least until the revolutionary transition is complete, or make that transition of capitals permanent. Fidel Castro once declared a new capital based on his own location. Countries do change capital cities after all. The United States, it used to be Philadelphia. Parallel governments should make proclamations and hold official ceremonies at which they describe the policies of the parallel government, motivating public support by promising redistribution upon being installed in power. I wouldn't do that right away. I would just start with role-playing legislative sessions as the first step. Also just learning the theory and codifying the theory. But, if you do it among people who are political, they'll probably also be parts of various organizations or going to various events. So there can be that cross-pollination of the parallel government with the rest of the social movement that way. Sometimes revolutionary parties and revolutionary governments are practically the same thing, but not exactly. The Bolshevik Party certainly became a governing institution, but the real revolutionary government it advocated was the workers' councils. The African National Congress of the South African anti-apartheid struggle in some ways functioned both as an opposition party and an opposition government, though it also formed a Congress of the People. The Indian National Congress of Indian Independence is similar, as well as the Palestine Liberation Organization. Frelimo, or the Mozambique Liberation Front, functioned as a sort of party army which both fought a guerrilla war and became a ruling party, not dissimilar from the Communist Party of China in the Chinese Civil War. Parentheses, this text uses a lot of examples of struggles whose politics it does not necessarily or fully endorse, end parentheses. So I have a list of parallel governments. UNITA, I can't remember what country that's from, was a primarily military organization, yet also had a chief of staff, underlining the way many African liberation movements were a synthesis between parties and armies. What was the Voltaic Democratic Union? African Democratic Rally. French West Africa, French Equatorial Africa, which was part of decolonization. Okay, I'm just gonna leave a link in my notes. In some way, political conflicts are conflicts between two governing coalitions. Coalitions of parties or coalitions of people. And there's, not really a difference between a political party and an aspiring government, except that one of them works through the established electoral system and one of them works outside the established electoral system in protest of it. So in some ways, building a parallel government is like building a political party, but one that does not run in the elections, one that denounces the elections as illegitimate. In the Yemeni civil war, there were two opposing governments. You have the National Council of Resistance of Iran. They are far out because I think they formed a parallel administration, but like just as an agreement between two people in a hotel room once. But I'm not sure I have the proof of that. Also, I'm not like 100% about their politics. They've been criticized as like a puppet of the West, but also they claim to be democratic socialist and they mean like real socialism. Here's maybe a note to close on, because it's kind of a brutal, controversial point. We are not trying to build some kind of parallel economy, not a commune or a workers' cooperative. We are not trying to build some kind of local community dual power like Mary Bookchin. We are trying to build revolutionary governments, opposition governments at the city, regional, national, and intergovernmental level. So this is just sort of, I mentioned in the last episode, parallel government got kind of watered down by modern liberals and modern anarchists who see any mutual aid society or any like labor union as a form of dual power. And in a narrow sense, maybe it is. Maybe a labor union could be considered workplace dual power, but only in a limited sense. A workers' council, which actually struggles to take over management and ownership, is a better example of workplace dual power than a labor union. But also, that when dual power was coined as a phrase, it did not mean things like starting mutual aid organizations or labor unions. It meant specifically the fact that there were multiple governments contending for power in Russia in 1917. So that was dual power. Is it possible that some of these mutual aid societies or some of these labor unions, preferably labor unions, would endorse a parallel government and give it more strength? Well, that is definitely desirable, but that does not mean a labor union is a parallel government. So, dual power is this concept, like any resistance at that point, if you're straying from the original definition of dual power, it could be considered dual power. But the real meaning of dual power is parallel government. And that is why Lenin was such a central theorist. Anyway, I've gone way over in terms of time. I may just do that from now. And then, unfortunately, I only got through like 5 more pages of my notes, leaving about 30 pages of the parallel government section unread. So I'm just going to keep going, keep making these. Hopefully, I'll get better and better at just powering through the notes instead of adding commentary. This is World Solution Writing Process, Episode 2, signing off.